Hello and welcome to Currents Up Close. My name is Jeff Olson. I'm a Public Safety Director and Chief of Police for the City of Cedar Falls. And with me today is Stephanie Sheets. She's the Planning and Community Services Manager. Welcome, Stephanie. Next to her is John Schilling. He is the Assistant Public Safety Director and Fire Chief. And next to him is David Sturch. And David is our Planner and our Code Enforcement Manager. Today what we want to talk a little bit about is some of our rental housing ordinance and some of the changes that are currently in process. So I think initially we want to explain a little bit about some of the problems we've had or what's initiated this change in the ordinance. So if any of you want to just jump in at any time, I think I'll just start out by explaining a little bit of what's occurred. You know, over the years we've had more single family homes converted into rental properties. And that has caused some challenges and some complaints from neighbors as far as, well, actually the neighborhood character is changing. We've seen a lot more parking lots added to backyards or side yards, a lot more parking in the streets.
One thing to add to that, Jeff, is from a zoning perspective, the parking ratio was guided by number of units. So for example, if it's a single family unit, you'd only have to provide 2 off-street parking stalls. Well, as these units or dwellings are converted, people would add, they might have been constructed with 1 or 2 bedrooms. The landlords would come in and create bedrooms in the basements or add more bedrooms to increase the occupancy to 4. Still only providing with 2 off-street parking stalls, it would add the stalls on the street with the added visitors, so you're going to more crowd the streets a little bit more with those vehicles.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And we'll get a little bit more into some of the parking changes and some of the other changes we've done too. But we also had complaints from citizens of unkept properties, whether that be garbage in the yard, whether it be unkept yards, whether that be paint, gutters, yards, all sorts of different things. And we've even had some single family homes that were changed into duplexes and things of this sort. And really the complaints have slowly come in over the years. In fact, if you recall, about 6 years ago, we passed an ordinance, a landlord accountability ordinance, to help address some of those problems. And that did do some help, but since then we've had a lot more complaints and a lot more properties converted over. And it's not that we don't want them to convert over, but we need to do that in a manner that doesn't disrupt the neighborhood character.
Yes, that landlord accountability ordinance really developed the relationship between city staff and the landlords, whereas we would try to work together to actually help the property, the tenants, to explain what the violation is, and I think that was a positive spin out with that. But we just want to go that extra step to create that more enforcement on these properties.
Absolutely, and we got a lot more, we have a lot of great landlords in town, but we got a lot more cooperation from all the landlords in town in helping address some of these problems. So that was a good start. You know, as I mentioned, we had a lot of complaints coming in, and the council was hearing a lot of complaints too. What they chose to do was create a task force to look at some of these problems. And so back in January of this year, the city created a task force, and I'm just going to list off the different members of the town. You know, we're talking about UNI officials, UNI students, citizens from the neighborhood, landlords, realtors, and city staff, all involved in this task force. And this task force was chaired by one of our councilmen, Frank Dara. We met for about 9 months. And I think we were all 4 of us were on that task force and attended quite a few evening meetings. Very educational process where we heard a lot of concerns from everybody, a lot of great suggestions. Ultimately, what the task force suggested or came up with was 4 recommendations for us. One was increase our code enforcement efforts. And as David knows, in the past, well, what we did is our enforcement was pretty much based upon complaints or safety violations. So we weren't as active in enforcement as maybe we could have been, or at least what this task force suggested. But that was by design too. They also recommended a training program for landlords and tenants. They also suggested a moratorium be passed during the time that we're making these changes, which the council did vote to do. There was a 6-month moratorium put in place. And they also suggested that staff develop an ordinance recommendation to send to the council. So all of those are either occurred or in the process of occurring. So maybe we should just talk briefly about the moratorium. I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to share a little bit about the moratorium and what has occurred there, or the purpose of that moratorium?
Sure, we can talk about the moratorium, and then I think it's worth spending a little bit more time on the code enforcement and going through that a little bit. But the moratorium was passed in in August of 2014, and it is set to expire February 18th of 2015. During that 6-month period, we were looking at what ordinance changes do we need to make, and that was not just about the rental code, it was also about the zoning ordinance. But today we're just really going to talk about some of the rental code changes that we're looking at. During the time of that moratorium, we had a hardship committee in place. So if somebody said, you know, I really need to rent my property, I'm under, you know, real time constraint or an extenuating circumstance, we said, well, the message was not about stop all rentals anywhere, everywhere. It was about notifying property owners that there's some changes that are going to be happening to our ordinances and wanting to make sure that any new situations understood those. So 3 of us here, you, myself, and John Schilling are on that hardship committee. We've received, I think it's 14 applications to this point. And the situations have been very varied as to what the property owners' concerns are. Some of them, they purchased them and have been renting them and had not obtained a valid rental permit. We found a couple of those, and it's good that we've got the word out that the rental permit is required so that people are getting those life and safety inspections that need to occur. Also, then we've seen some where they've been trying to sell their home for several months, and going into the winter, knowing that it's going to be a downturn for sales, and asking, can we rent this in the interim so that we can afford to have 2 house payments, basically. So those have been the hardship requests that we've seen. And with all of those, the committee's talking through what are some of the changes that we're anticipating. Nothing's final yet, but how do we think this is going to go, so that we're communicating with them, and then we're keeping that list to be back in touch with those folks at the time the ordinances are passed.
Sure, we certainly didn't want someone to obtain a permit and then have a few months later some changes occur that where it would either cost them some dollars or to redo some of the things they did. So the moratorium certainly made sense in that regard.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that during the moratorium hardship process that we were very upfront with those that have applied for their temporary rental permit until the moratorium has been expired and the new code improvements were put in place. But we were very upfront with them that should any new changes come into the rental code, that they would have to apply those new changes to their property and actually apply for a permanent rental permit.
Yeah, and that was really, to me, that was a really important part, because you hate to have someone come in and start that rental process and then have some changes made later on. That was definitely an important part of that moratorium process. We were talking a little bit about code enforcement. Maybe this would be a good time to hit upon that. Dave, if you want to talk a little bit about some of maybe the code enforcement violations we've had, and I know we've got a few photographs.
Yeah, I can do that. Basically, the code enforcement staff really focuses on the nuisance section of the ordinance. Now, there are some nuisance-related activities, from front yard parking to junk vehicle to building maintenance, property maintenance. We also deal with zoning violations too, but from the nuisance standpoint, we look at junk in the yards, basically items that were not normally used in the day-to-day activity of the yard should be stored in a totally enclosed structure and out of public view. You've got some garbage debris in the yard, some pallets, some wood. Those all fall under the nuisance section of that ordinance. When we're talking about front yard parking, the vehicles are in the front yard, they're on the grass. It basically leads to grass being destroyed, dirt ruts, mud holes in the front yard. It's just really not conducive for a nice, clean environment for a neighborhood. This is an example of a unauthorized, unpermitted expansion of a parking area that just really tears up the backyard. So the goal with the staff on code enforcement is get those cars back you know, this is one off the alley, that we can get them off the alley, have them develop a viable parking lot plan to coordinate the placement of those vehicles and basically return that backyard into what it's supposed to be, and that's grass and the absence of mud holes, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned before, you know, we're based on code complaint basis, but we really jumped in and geared into more of a proactive approach since August of the last year. Not just code enforcement staff, it's multiple departments going out looking for violations. We set up the grid system throughout the town. There's 40+ grids, you know, in Cedar Falls, and we're starting with individualized grids, and we're going through and inspecting every property, from building maintenance to, again, front yard parking and junk in the yard. And basically, the idea is to cover the entire town. One grid may take 2, 3, 4 weeks. Others may take a little more time, but our goal is to try to complete the entire town in, you know, 4 to 5, 6, 7 years. And then as we find violations, you know, we send out letters to the property owners, to the tenants, if needed. And we want them just to kind of evaluate the letter and assess the situation and give us a call. I mean, the staff is more than willing to work with the property owners to achieve compliance, because at the end of the day, the violation will be corrected on that. So,
Okay.
I think it should be emphasized that we're not singling out rental properties on the code enforcement efforts. I think it should be emphasized that this is all property within the city limits of Cedar Falls. So we're going to be addressing not only rental properties, but we're talking about single-family home properties and even commercial properties that are not in compliance with the code enforcement rules.
Yeah, absolutely. This is designed, as you said, a grid system to hit every property within the city within a certain number of years. It's a pretty big task, because there's over 10,000 properties in the city, so it'll take some time, but it's definitely an effort that we should, you know, take care of.
in time, we realize when we do send out the letters, we have to base the severity of the issue on time to correct the violation. Now, front yard parking, the vehicle can be removed in a day. Put it in the driveway or park in the street. When we're talking about a new roof or a new coat of paint, new windows on a house, I mean, realize that this time of year, we're not going to be doing any of that type of work. So we want to work with the property owners to set up a plan and set up a time frame for them to correct the violations. A lot of times people realize that they need to fix their house, and they get the letter from the city, and it just kind of stirs that dialogue and the need for repair.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about the problem at the beginning of the program, and the Landlord Accountability Ordinance helped. Code enforcement is helping, but there are certain things that they can't help, and thus we, as the task force said, need to look at some ordinance changes, and maybe we should talk about those a little bit, because code enforcement alone can't address every problem. But I think before we do that, maybe we'll just take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the ordinance changes, the inspection process, some classes for the landlords and that kind of thing. So thanks for watching. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Currents Up Close. We're talking about rental housing today with Stephanie Sheets, who is the Planning and Community Services Manager, John Schilling, our Assistant Public Safety Director and Fire Chief, and David Sturch, who's our Planning and Code Enforcement Manager. So we want to talk a little bit more, continue talking about our rental housing ordinance and some of the changes that are coming forward. We've talked a little bit about code enforcement, the moratorium, the task force and what they suggested, and now maybe we should talk a little bit about the changes in the task force. I think the ordinance has been put together and is being considered by council now. I don't know if you want to cover some of the details on that.
Sure, I'll try to cover some of the highlights. As I've talked with people who call and ask questions, I try to tell them I'm going to try to give you the elevator speech so that you kind of understand the basics of the ordinance. Obviously, there's a lot in that ordinance, a lot that's written. But I guess to start off, what we want to emphasize with people is that this is a compromise. And certainly there are a variety of ways that you can address these, and you can address it as a one-size-fits-all. But we felt that it would be fair that based on what the structure, what the lot can accommodate, it certainly seems fair that perhaps instead of setting a low standard that's the standard everybody has to comply with, it might be a graduated approach where, depending on the conditions of the property and like I said, that carrying capacity that it has. So our ordinance provides options for a rental property, and I'm going to go over we've split it into existing rentals and new rentals to try to keep it clear, because we address each one just a little bit differently in the ordinance. So an existing rental, a lot of people are familiar with the 4 unrelateds that they're able to have. If we go to the first slide on existing rentals, this kind of gives the overview that I was talking about with the rental ordinance, that existing registered rentals can continue with 4 unrelated persons until the sale or the transfer of the property. At that point, and we'll get into this in just a little bit, we'll talk about whether 4 or 3 is appropriate. But an existing rental never goes lower than 3 unrelated. In the new rental situation, we're limited to a family, 2 unrelated persons, or a group rental. And this is where I talked about the flexibility of the ordinance, saying that perhaps up to even 5 unrelated people is appropriate, depending on the carrying capacity of that property. Other things to be aware of in both existing rentals and new rentals is that driveway and parking areas must be hard surfaced. Gravel won't be permitted anymore, and there'll be a timeline to address that. The staff committee, for the most part, is reviewing deviations, primarily that group permit that I talked about when you would like to exceed the 2 unrelated persons in a new rental situation. We'll talk about the family definition just a little bit. We've modernized that and tried to address some of the trends of what a family is considered nowadays. And finally, throughout the ordinance, there are a variety of appeal opportunities that are worked into it, trying to again say that we know that there are going to be situations where we're going to have to consider them individually, and there might be cause for having a deviation from the limit that is set. So just talking about existing rentals in a little bit more detail, we talked about how existing rentals are used to the 4 unrelated persons. And if at sale or transfer, then there's an evaluation that happens based on the carrying capacity again. And if that lot, as this slide shows, has a lot width that's less than 70 feet, a lot area less than 8,000 square feet, street width for that neighborhood less than 31 feet, and no parking on one side, then that probably fits the conditions of that lot may not be able to accommodate 4 unrelated people. We're not saying that that's going to be the case all the time, and so that's where the appeal comes in, and that possibility to say, hey, my lot, maybe I have some of these conditions, but I have some other conditions that might be appropriate to evaluate. And then on the other side of that, if the lot area is greater than 70 feet in width, and the lot area is greater than 8,000 square feet, street width is bigger, and maybe the parking spaces are provided on the lot, well then, 4 unrelated people can continue to be occupying that particular property. So we're working in taking a look at the carrying capacity and what's appropriate for a lot.
I think something to add with that, Stephanie, is, as I mentioned before, as a single-family dwelling only provided 2 off-street parking, the new ordinances will be looking at number of parking stalls per bedroom in these units. So if you want 3 bedrooms, you need to have the 3 stalls. So that's counting garage space, driveway space, or anything that you can get to a backyard for a parking lot. So the big thing is making sure the tenants have your off-street parking, and then those parking lots are upgraded in time from a gravel to concrete with curb and gutter and landscaping and screening. So it's just the whole improvement to these properties as they come around.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The point is, we're linking the number of parking spaces on a property to the number of bedrooms that are provided there. That usually there's a direct link there about the occupancy levels. So that's why we're making that link a little bit stronger than it has been, because I don't want to make it sound like rental property is not complying right now. They're currently meeting what we have in our ordinance. So that's some of the ordinance changes that we need to kind of keep up with the changing times of typically it's one person per bedroom, but that obviously isn't the case every single time.
And some of the parking situations too, we talk about a parking lot, but it could be something as simple as, I think maybe you alluded to, as a 2-stall garage for 2 cars and then 2 parked in the driveway as well, or something of that sort too.
Yeah, those are the kind of cases we're looking at. We're looking at more of a tandem arrangement. So we talk a stall in the garage or 2 stalls in the garage and then 2 in the driveway, not necessarily getting that 3rd stall to block those extra cars. So we're kind of, that's our evaluation is what the driveway can handle, what the garage can handle.
And I think in designing that ordinance, there was obviously a lot of thought that went into that. It's interesting to note that back in 1970, the standard was 5, and it moved to 4, which is interesting to note. Back in 1970s, this concern came about too, and there's some ordinance changes.
So over time, we've had that change in the market and that response to how ordinances have changed to address the situations at that time.
That's right, and I just thought that was real interesting. Something else we intend to do too is every 6 months reevaluate this ordinance to see if there's any unintended consequences that may have occurred, because as you can imagine, you put something together, you think it's going to work this way, and a few things may not occur exactly what we designed. So we certainly want to be flexible and look at that ordinance about every 6 months and make sure it's doing exactly what we designed it to do.
So we're looking at 6 months after the ordinance has been passed, evaluating that for unintended consequences, and then at a year as well.
Yep, absolutely. If we could, maybe we should take a look at...
We should talk about the new rental situation.
Yep, okay.
So we've kind of covered the existing rentals, but new rentals, then what folks need to keep in mind, if it is not currently a rental property and they would like to obtain a rental property, then those start off at a guaranteed 2 unrelated people. Then from there, there's, and also I should say, also guaranteed that a family can rent there. When we get into the request to have more than 2 unrelated people living there, then we get into this group rental that terminology that we're calling it, and we're looking at, again, the carrying capacity of that property. And there are, about 6 different criteria that are listed on this slide that we're looking to evaluate. And I think that the primary areas, and I should back up, the ordinance isn't worded that you have to meet all of these. It says that these are the criteria we're going to look at, and we're looking at the degree to which they're met or not met in making a determination about what's appropriate for that lot. Does that lot and does that house have the carrying capacity? But the primary ones that we're probably really looking at and holding a little bit more attention to is the size of the lot, the parking that's provided. Is it adequate parking for that lot and off-street? And the neighborhood character. How does this fit in with, are there already a lot of rentals in this neighborhood, and one more doesn't push it over the tipping point? Or are there just a couple, and those couple may not be providing for what they need to do, and so this is going to push it over the tipping point if this one doesn't meet the requirements. So that type of evaluation is going to happen. Also, what's the street like? Is the street wide enough for on-street parking? Is it already taken up? Are there already concerns about access along that street? So those are some of the the ones that we'll pay a lot more attention to, I think, in this list of criteria.
Sure, and should we take a look at that slide that also lists the different cities and some of the changes that they've had, or some of the criteria that we have that we evaluated? I know you called a lot of
we
cities.
counted up. We probably looked at about 40 different communities, and then we kind of shortlisted to around 20 or 25 that we thought met the same kind of similar population to us. Obviously, you see population ranges, and that they had a university town, and the enrollment, hopefully we're trying to look at ones that were similar in enrollment numbers and how that stacked up to the percentage of rentals in the community. And we found that, there are 2 communities on this list, and there were certainly others where they just set a number. and said, this is what we think it needs to be everywhere. And then we were finding that there were several that had a tiered approach and said, kind of like we're approaching it, is the capacity of that lot might say that, well, in one situation, 2 is appropriate. In another situation, maybe 5 is appropriate. And so that's where we kind of came up with this concept of having a tiered approach, is by taking a look at some other communities.
Absolutely, and I think that tiered approach is the way to go, because you have some flexibility for people that have properties that can fit more than 2 or 3 or 4,
right,
perhaps. So,
yeah.
Well, we could move into some of the inspections process, unless somebody wants to just add a little bit more to this ordinance and how this went. John, I know the fire department conducts all the inspections, and maybe you want to explain a little bit about that process and how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually going to be adding an additional step into the process that will complement all these ordinance changes and improvements that we're going through council right now. We're going to start with, there's 2 different types of properties that we're going to be evaluating. Number 1 is existing rental properties. And what we'll do there is we will, if the property is an existing rental, has an active permit at the time that these ordinances are put in place, when they reapply for that permit, the permit cycle is every 3 years that the property is reevaluated and issued a new permit if it meets all the existing standards. What we're going to be doing is when that person comes in to apply for a new permit, then the first step of the new process is going to be handing that application over to David and let him evaluate the property itself to make sure it meets those criteria that we've recently established through the rental task force. The step after that would be if he determines that it's a 3 or that has a capacity for 4, then we go inside the structure, the fire department does, and we evaluate the fire and life safety, health and welfare aspects of the existing minimum rental housing code to determine if it truly does meet that on the inside of the property. So not only are we looking at the inside of the property, but we're also looking at the outside of the property to, again, help meet those recommendations that came out of the rental task force. It should be emphasized that an existing property that is an active rental property, that permit stays with the property owner. Now, when there's a sale or a transfer of the property, that permit doesn't follow the property. A new owner would have to come in and apply. Now, what that means is when a new owner comes in and applies, then they start out at an occupancy level of 3. And then we go through the process of evaluating the external pieces of the property.
For an existing rental.
For an existing rental.
Yep.
And then we go into the inside of the property and we evaluate the fire, life safety, health, and welfare aspects of the property. So, existing rentals, if they're sold or transferred, or if they're just applying for a new permit, don't automatically drop to 2. And I know that's been a question out in the public lately is, why do we drop to 2? Well, you don't drop to 2. If it's existing and you're just reapplying and you're already at 4, then you stay at 4. If there's a sale or transfer, then you start at 3 for the new owner.
But you can certainly jump to 4 or 5.
But you can jump to 4, possibly even 5, yes.
And even if somebody is considering turning a property into rental or has questions, they can give us a call and we can go out and take a look and say, this particular property would qualify for a 3 or a 4, or whatever the number is.
Yeah, we'd be more than happy to give a staff opinion of the property that's proposed to be turned into a rental property. Now, when we create a new rental property, let's focus on new ones this time. The process is very similar. However, on a new rental property, meaning one that's never been or wasn't currently registered as a rental property, we started at the level of 2, like Stephanie explained, where you're guaranteed to have 2 people and or a family to occupy the property. And then we start the process. David gets it. He looks at the external components of the property, evaluates them to meet the criteria of the new standard, and then we go in with the fire, life safety, health, and welfare inspections on the inside. And we'll come up with a determination of whether it's a 2, 3, 4, or possibly even a 5.
Okay. And I know another thing that the task force recommended was training for the landlords and the tenants, and I know you're putting a program together now.
Yeah, the city staff is diligently putting together a rental training program for landlords and tenants. And prospectively, we're going to have that training program put out by the end of February. And we'll send an invitation out to all the landlords, and we'll get some public notices out to tenants that we're going to have this informative training program. It'll be in the evening, so it meets a lot of people's work schedules. And we'll start off and we'll talk a little bit about what we're talking today, about the new changes to the rental ordinance. And then we'll also spend some time talking about the issues that we run into with landlords on a consistent basis, the issues that we run into with tenants on a consistent basis, and how these problems can be alleviated through just good knowledge of what the rental code is and the ability to correct those issues. And then, of course, we'll open it up at the end for questions and comments from
Certainly.
the participants in the training.
Okay. Before we wrap it up, is there anything that we forgot or we should add, or is there any?
I think,
No?
again, if this generates questions from people, we've already been having questions coming in, and we're trying to, as much as possible, clarify those or talk about how it impacts their particular lot and give them a little bit of a preliminary opinion about that. Obviously, this code provides for it going through formal review, but we're certainly going to try to help people understand where they might fall on that.
Okay, thank you. I guess the whole goal is to help improve some of these neighborhoods that we've received a lot of complaints on, and hopefully over time see some improvements and prevent other neighborhoods from hitting that tipping point, as we frequently heard the term, to change them into a better neighborhood, neighborhood with a character that they used to have, as we've heard from many homeowners, quite frankly,
Yeah.
homeowners, yeah. So, well, we'd like to thank you for watching Currents Up Close, and we hope you found this an informative show. Thank you for joining us.